Hey everyone, my name is Rick Gualtieri and this is Tales of a Midlist Author. And welcome to NaNoWriMo. If you're doing it this year, you're probably started, or if you haven't, it's not too late. We're still pretty early in the month. You probably do have a few days to catch up on, but it's definitely not impossible. But with regards to that, I wanted to talk about panting versus plot, or pantsing versus plotting today. And these are really two fairly established methods of figuring out what's happening in your story, and a third kind of hybrid method we'll talk about later. But why do we discuss this? Well, stories require that stuff happens in them, and you as the writer, your job is to come up with that stuff in whatever manner works for you. Now, if it's your first book, you're probably going to need to figure this out. But eventually, you will come down to your style. You will find out your style. Personally, I use both. I switch off between the two depending on what story I'm writing, or depending on where the muse takes me. But each of them has kind of their pluses and minuses. I will say this before getting into what plotting versus pantsing is. I usually don't start a story unless I have a beginning and a probable end in mind. Now, that ending can change because the stories evolve as you write them. That's not a big deal. But I don't like to just start a story and then just see where see where it ends. I like to have an end point in mind. And I find that that's helpful only because it kind of gives me something as I'm writing to to kind of like a goal towards, as opposed to just reaching a point and being like, well, I guess the story's over now. Which I find can be a little iffy, just personally. So let's talk about these two things. Pantsing. Pantsing means essentially writing by the seat of your pants. As I said, I might go in there, I might have a beginning, and I might have an end. I have no idea starting off what's going to happen, but I'm going to start writing, and I'm just going to figure out what happens. And really, as far as figuring that out, a lot of it just comes down to, okay, there's a general tenet out there that basically, for story, that basically says, what does your hero want most? And story elements essentially are, how do you keep them from getting it? So, hey, my hero wants to go to the store. Well, Bob stepped outside and his car's tires were flat. He hailed Uber, and Uber pulled up and told him to go fuck himself and drove off. Basically ways to keep them from from getting to that. Otherwise, it's like watching a sitcom where you realize that, if just a certain thing happened, there would be no story here. Stories are all about things happening. And typically, there's a reason, for a person to get from A to point B, and things that, get thrown in their way. Pantsing is really just making that stuff up as you go. I started off pantsing. I know Bill the Vampire and the first several books in that series were all written that way, where it's like, hey, I know where I'm starting, I know where I want to end up, and let's see where this takes me. And the awesome thing about that is sometimes a story can take you into wonderful new directions that you never would have thought of. And it's just kind of and sometimes you do write yourself into a wall that way. In fact, I think with pantsing, it's much easier to write yourself into a corner there. But that's what the delete button's for. But sometimes, stories just evolve in natural ways. One of my favorite characters in Tome of Bill, Gann, originally when I thought up the plot, was really just supposed to be a quick cameo. She showed up for one or two scenes, and that was it. But as I was writing her, I was like, this is a cool character. Now, this character needs to be part of the main plot, And that's kind of how, that evolved. Sometimes the most wonderful things can happen with pantsing. Of course, sometimes you can you can sit down with a story and be like, okay, I have no idea where to take this now, and that's happened also a few times with me. So pantsing definitely has its downsides. Not knowing, it's like going on a road trip and being like, yeah, I want to get there, but I'm not going to use any maps and I'm not going to use GPS. I'm just going to figure out how to get there myself. You may wind up there eventually. You may not wind up there eventually. You may wind up stuck in a ditch somewhere, or you may wind up having the most awesome adventure of your lifetime. You don't know. So, risk reward there. Plotting involves typically outlining your story ahead of time. Now, this can be either super detailed or high level. I've done both. I've done high level, you know, high level outlines where essentially, okay, here's section one of the book, here's something that happens. Section two, here's what happens. Section three, here's what happens. I've also done and seen super detailed outlines that pretty much are almost mini novels of themselves, ensuring that the author, you, never gets lost because every point that's happening. Now, here's the thing. It's a map. It doesn't mean you can't go off the map, and that's one of my problems with plotting. Is I tend to write myself a map, and then I go, hey, let's see where this dirt road goes, and just follow a tangent. So I will say, on occasion when I plot, I do go off the rails, and a story goes completely different than I assumed it would. I know one of my later Tome of Bill books, The Wicked Dead, started off one way and went in a completely different direction, even though I had an outline there. Personally, I like doing outlines best if it's a story with heavy continuity, like later in a series. I also like whenever I'm doing horror, especially monster horror, to have an outline, because at any given time, an outline helps me see where the monsters are versus where the heroes are. So there's no cheating. So I don't want to cheating and just being like, okay, the monster who was 3 miles away 10 minutes ago, or 3 miles away in the last scene, we're 3 seconds later, and he teleports off screen to here. I don't like crap like that. And outlining helps me avoid that. As far as software goes, honestly, I just use Microsoft Word, but I know people do have they do use some outlining software. That's entirely up to you. But personally, you can just do all that stuff with Word, Notepad, anything you have handy. You can outline it, because it really is just kind of a thing as you go along. And typically, what I like to do as I'm running through the outline is I like to kind of highlight where I've left off for the next day, so I can just jump right back in. Downside is some people, I think, can be a little rigid with their outlines, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a good or bad thing. Sticking to this outline, especially if it's super detailed, can really help you from going off the rails and and getting that vision out that you want to see. If you're not super intense about that, or if you do like a little spontaneity in your story, that can kill it a little bit. But it really comes down to doing what's best for the story. And sometimes, sometimes for me that involves sticking to my outline, and sometimes that involves going off the rails, and what have you. I don't think pantsing or plotting, either one is necessarily superior to the others or to the other. It just has to do with what works best for you. Now, I mentioned a hybrid style, and the last two books I wrote, both are in editing right now. Strange Days, Bill of the Dead Book 1, and Bent Out of Shape, which is the second in my Hybrid of High Moon series. I wrote those in kind of a hybrid manner, in that I wrote a very, very short plot summary, as in 1 or 2 paragraphs for each, and just said, this is what's happening. And then I wrote 100,000 words based off of that. So hybrid approach in that it gave me a tiny little bit of an outline, but not really enough to fill in details, where I was forced to kind of be like, okay, well, I know this is going to happen and I need to make this happen. So let me figure out how that works as I'm going. And I actually found that to be pretty good. It gave me that freedom to play around with the story and take it in interesting directions that it wouldn't have gone otherwise. But at the same time, it kind of gave me enough of a roadmap that I could look down. It essentially gave me a compass instead of a roadmap, so I could look down at any given time and be like, oh, I'm still heading east. That's good. And that kind of worked for me. So, but that being said, I use all 3 of those in my arsenal. I do what works best for the story, depending on what I'm working on. I know I've written 3 Shingles stories so far, and that's the series I wrote with my Authors and Dragons podcast crew, and it's been different each time. One was pantsed, one was plotted, and one was kind of a hybrid thing. What works best for you, you will figure out as the more you write, and the more books you finish. Again, there is no such thing as right and wrong here. It all comes down to what is best for you. All right. Well, my name is Rick Gualtieri. This is Tales of a Midlist Author. If you're participating in Nano, good luck. And if you're not, well, again, good luck in whatever endeavors you are working on. Talk to you again soon.